Hello. In this video, we will talk about the for loop, which is one of the multiple loops that we have in Java and other programming languages. So in general, we have something called the for loop, the while loop, the do while loop, and sometimes it's called for each or the enhanced for loop. So in this video, we will focus on the for loop. In general, a loop is used to repeat code without having to copy and paste code. What does that mean? It means that if I ask you to repeat a word, let's say hello, 3 times. In this case, what you could do is that you could go and say hello, and then you could go and repeat it 3 times. So whenever I give an example like this is basically just a trivial solution or a trivial problem. But in general, when you think about it, what if you are going to, I ask you to, for example, to ask the user for 5 values to convert them from Celsius to Fahrenheit. So in this case, that can be complicated because you're going to repeat this code 5 times, you copy and paste this code 5 times, you have 5 variables. That's a lot of work. So what we want to do is to be able to have in an elegant way to do that repetition without copying and pasting like this. All right. Another example that is a little bit more practical is, let's say, for example, here that you have some kind of a test, all right? So let's say you're testing an application similar to Expedia. And then I tell you that, hey, I want you to go find this button or like link, click it. And then what I want you to do is to check if you can basically make a booking for 5 adults and 3 kids. All right, well, let's keep it 5 adults to make it simple. So what would you do? What you will need to do is to say, like, I'm going to find this link, I'm going to open this window, I'm going to find this plus sign, and then I'm going to click it. So how would you do it? You would say something like this. Find the plus button, and then you would go and say, click. And then because you need to click it 3 or 4 times, you would go and copy and paste. That is not an elegant solution, all right? So what we want to do is to be able to do that click 3 times, 4 times, 5 times without having to copy and paste the code multiple times. So how do we do this? And the solution for this is loop, all right? Now, the thing is, if I ask you, and this is a very simple exercise that we can do, is that I ask you to repeat or to count from 1 to 5. Naturally, what you do is that you open your hand and you start to go and say, like, okay, with the other hand, you start to point 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? So you are pointing at the fingers and you are controlling all of this. So in that process, you did 3 things very important. First of all, you had a counter. The second is that you had a condition, which is if I reached the 5th finger, I need to stop because I reached my end of condition. And then that counter kept moving over these fingers one by one, and that would be an update. So these are the 3 parts that you needed to do that process of repeating something, which is counting from 1 to 5 or saying hello 5 times, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, hello, 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 hello. All right, so that's exactly what you need to control a loop in Java. So the first loop that we are talking about is the for loop, right? And basically the way I read this one is that it says for a specific number of times, I want to repeat something, all right? That something could be a print statement, as simple as that, or it could be a click of a button. It could be a whole process of processing a complete array of names or usernames. It's really up to you. All right, so how do we do this? So what we do is that we go and say for, I need a counter, int I is equal to 0. I'm going to call it I. I is less than, let's say 5. That's my control here, my condition. And then I plus plus. So in this case, if you look at this structure here, all right, you have the for keyword, That's the loop. And then you have basically here a counter, and then a condition, and then you have the update. Now, in that specific case, if I try to align these a little bit, it would be out of format. But that specific update was what? That specific update is an increment. All right. So that here are the three, these are the three parts that you can think of for any for loop. All right. And then what do we want to do? Let's make it a very simple scenario here. Click the plus button. And then if I run it, it's going to click the button 5 times, starting from 0 and going to 5. All right, so how does that work really? How does the for loop work? Now, to understand this completely, we will need to do something, and we will need to actually practice on how to do this, something called tracing the code. Tracing the code is your process of acting as if you are basically Java, right? So you will think as Java. And that is many times very useful for you to find errors or mistakes that you have in your code. So if you look at this, I have here the I, which is my counter. And then I have my output, which I can put here as the output. And then what I'm going to do is to start to trace this code. Now, if I want to trace this code, all right, I have to see how actually how does the for loop work? So the for loop, the way it works is that it starts from here, which is the initialization of the counter. And I like to give the number 0 for this step. All right. And then what happens next is that it jumps to the next step, which is to check the condition of whether the initialized counter is less than the limit or not. So that would be step number 1. If it's satisfied, if it's true, then I will go inside the loop, which would be executing this step, step number 2. So that would be printing. So basically here, initialization of 0. So that I means I is 0 at the beginning. And then is 0 less than 5? The answer is yes. In that case, go inside and print this statement. So I'm going to just say, and make it nicer here and say, like. All right. All right. And then what's going to happen next is that this is going, after finishing that iteration here, it will go back here, run this part, which is step number 3. And then that step number 3 is going to say increment I by 1. So that is an increment over here. So notice that the click and increment is the part of that iteration. Do you see that? And then once I incremented I, what I do next is that I go back to step number 1 again. And I check, is this new I, which is 1, less than 5? If the answer is yes, then I will go inside and repeat the same thing. The answer is actually yes. So I'm going to go inside and I'm going to do click. And then I'm going to go here and increment 2, and then click, and then increment 3, and then click, because 3 is less than, right? And then 4, and then click. Now, after 4 and click, it goes to 5. Now, the question is, when it gets to 5, because when it was 4, 4 is less than 5, yes, go inside, print, go back increment, it becomes 5. And then the next question is 5 less than 5? And the answer is no. So in that case, I'm going to stop. All right. So basically here, if you notice, there is a loop. There is something happening here, which is that loop over there. You are in a loop, basically. So when do I stop this loop? It happens when the condition becomes unsatisfied. When does the condition get unsatisfied? When the I gets to the point where it becomes 5. So one common mistake that people do when they learn loops for the first time is that they say I is less than 5 is the condition. This means I must be 4. But if I is equal to 4, 4 is less than 5, and I should be inside this loop, right? So truly, it's going to stop once I becomes 5, and 5 is less than 5 is false. And this is when you stop, and then you basically exit, and you move the control to outside the block of the for loop. So you end up in this point here. All right, so that here is just the flow of the for loop and how it really works, moving between the conditions, increment, and the print. All right, then the next thing that we need to talk about is what are the different scenarios of the for loop. All right, so we understand that the for loop is helping us to repeat things. And this is basically the flow chart of this. I ask the question, is it, am I at this point where the condition is not satisfied anymore? If the answer is no, all right, is it true? Yes. So if it's true, then keep going and repeat the statements, increment, go back, repeat. If it becomes false, 5 is not less than 5, then exit, all right? So in this case, loop is used in programming to repeat a specific block of code as long as a certain condition is met. Another thing that I would like to point out, and I bring it here because many people get confused and say like, hey, this looks exactly like an if statement, asking a question and answer is yes or no. So why wouldn't we use if statement to do this? And the answer is if statement flows in one direction. Look at these arrows. All of them are pointing down. If you pour from here, it will just go from here, or it will take this path and continue down. And that is not useful. It's not useful because there is no path to go back up and repeat something. The loop takes you back up. There is an arrow that takes you upward, which is nice and helps us to repeat certain codes. All right, then the next thing that we want to talk about, so we talked about the structure, we talked about the initialization, the condition, and the increment or decrement, which we abbreviated to be update. So update represents either an increment or decrement, as we will see in the next parts. And this here basically explains the iteration thing, the tracing that we did, which is start from first iteration. Initialization is happening. This happens one time at the beginning. And that's something we need to remember. All right. So once I is initialized, it's not going to be initialized again. So initialize I to 0, and then that happens once, and then we check the condition. If it's satisfied, do the input or do the output, sorry, and then go back and increment. That moves you to iteration number 2, iteration number 3, iteration number 4, where 3 is not less than 3. And in that case, it's false stop. All right, so this is basically the same tracing. Another thing to be or to understand here is that if the condition is not satisfied or will never be violated, basically, in that case, what's going to happen is that your loop will be running infinitely. All right, so basically here what's going to happen is if an I is equal to 0, and then I is less than 5 is the condition, and 0 is less than 5, but then instead of incrementing my I, I'm going to decrement my I. So what's going to happen? Let's trace it. Initialize I to 0. 0 is less than 5. Yes. Print. Go back here. Decrement I. I becomes -1. -1 less than 5. Yes. Print. Decrement. -2. -3. -4. There is no way the I is going to be greater than 5. So nothing is going to stop this loop. And it's going to run infinitely until your computer basically crashes. Now, one thing I would like to point out here is that it doesn't really run infinitely. It's going to run as long as I is an integer until the value of I. So what does that mean? Or the minimum value of integer, right? So if we do it this way, it's going to take forever to do that. But if, for example, here, I decrement by, let's make 100,000, then that is going to keep until the maximum value, the 2 billion something, if you remember, the minimum value of int is going to be here. And this is where it's going to stop, basically. But relatively, we still call it infinite loop because it's relatively infinite. You want it to run for 5 times and you had to run for 2 billion something. That's relatively infinite. All right. So in this case, don't just, say like, oh, it's not an infinite loop. It is an infinite loop. Okay. But you, at the same time, you also know where it's going to stop, ideally. All right. So there are other variations or notes that I would like to point out here. So I like to call it notes. So we will have some notes about the loops, all right? Or the for loop specifically. The first thing that we need to understand is that many people do a mistake when they learn loops for the first time, which is to put semicolon, no semicolon after the for loop header, all right? Otherwise, it will not loop. So this is a very, very common mistake that people do, which is they go and say for int I is equal to 0, and then I is less than 10, I plus plus. And then what they do out of a habit is that they just put the semicolon here, and then they build a block or open the block, and then they say sys out hello. And then when they run, they get surprised that, hey, it's not looping, it's just printing one time. So notice here what happened when I asked Eclipse to auto-indent my code. Look at this. It basically treated this as this is the for loop, here is a semicolon, and then this is just a block of code that is going to run system.out.println hello one time. So if I run it, it's just truly going to run this one time, nothing. All right, so that's because the semicolon terminates the for loop. So basically you just looped in the air, doing nothing for 5 times or 10 times, and then you went to print this statement one time. All right, so this is a common mistake that people do, and be careful with it. With practice, it will become easy for you to remember this one. The other thing that we want to remember is that it doesn't always have to be increment. You could decrement. I just showed you that, right? So you can increment or decrement. So for example, here for int I is equal to 5, I is greater than 0, I plus I minus minus. All right. And in this case, I'm going to print I, and that is going to give me, starting from 5, going all the way down to 0. So it's going to run 6 times, printing 5 to 0. All right. The other thing that I would like to say is that you can increment and decrement in any way you want. So you can increment and decrement with any step you wish. It does not have to be 1. So what does that mean? It means that if you have your update, all right, so for int I is equal to 0, I is less than 10, I could increment by 2. So when we say I plus plus or plus plus I or so on, this is just an increment of 1. This is equivalent to saying I plus equal 1, right? So here we go. If I print this, it's just going to print the same exact thing. And let me do that here. It's going to do the same exact thing, 0, 1, 2, 3, all the way to 9. So that increment is equivalent to I plus plus. We already know that. It's also equivalent to saying equal to I plus 1 if I want to. And that's exactly the same thing. So since this is the same, we could also say plus equal 3, for example, if I want to. And that's going to print 0, 3, 6, 9. Right? So you can update and decrement, increment whatever you want with any number of steps that you need. All right? We have seen the infinite loop, of course. The other things that you can use I plus plus or plus plus I. And similarly, I minus minus or minus minus I. And this is something that we need to understand of why this works. All right. So not just that it works, we want to understand why this works. And the reason to understand this part, or the reason why this actually works, is if you follow the steps of the for loop, as we said, initialization, condition, body of the for loop, and then update. So basically the update is happening as a separate step. And if you remember from before, we said that I plus plus is the same as plus plus I. All right. As long as it's happening as a separate line in your code, it's not going to make any difference. When did it make difference? It made difference when we said something like this, sys out I plus plus, and this is when we had to think like, hey, is it going to print first or increment first? So because I mixed operations of printing and incrementing or printing and decrementing, then I had to think about it. But here there's no confusion. I plus plus is happening as a separate line of operation. And in that case, it's not going to get confused with anything else. All right. Now, the last two things that we need to think about is that you can, this is one more note here, or maybe two more. You can use any number of counters, conditions, and updates. So what does that mean? It means that I could actually do something like this. I could go and say for int I is equal to 0 and j is equal to 5. I is less than 5 and j is greater than 5. Let's make j start from 10. I plus plus and j minus minus. So look at the structure of this thing. It can be a little bit confusing, but it's possible, and it will be very useful for you in the future once you start to think about problems, especially when it comes to interview problems. So I still have my structure. I still have counters. I still have condition. I still have update, but I'm controlling multiple variables at the same time. So how would that work if I try to, for example, say sysout I plus space plus j? Think about it. Very similar approach as we did with any other loop. I starting from 0, j starting from 10, right? So you can think about it as I starting from 0, j starting from 10. My condition is I is less than 5, j is greater than 5. So I ask myself here, hey, is 0 less than 5 and 10 is greater than 5? The answer is yes. Go inside and print. So I'm going to print 0 and 10. Then increment this, decrement that. So that becomes 1, this becomes 9. That becomes 2, this becomes 8, 3, 7. You see the pattern here. So in this case, if I run it, it's going to actually print 0, 10, 1, 9, 2, 8, 3, 7, 4, 6. All right. In a bit, I will show you how this can be a little bit useful in the future. All right. So a few other things that I would like to also mention is that you have to understand that the parts of the for loop are all optional. What does that mean? It means that would be note number 6. All the parts of the for loop header are optional, except for the semicolons. All right, so what does that mean? Let me Make that a little bit here so you can see it. So if I go here and say for semicolon, semicolon, that is still going to work. Java is not going to basically complain about it. See, no errors, no compile time error, nothing. So if I run this one, it's just going to be an infinite loop because you didn't have a counter, you didn't have a condition, you didn't have a control, you didn't have anything, but you have a valid structure of for loops. All right. Now, given this piece of information, this also implies many things. It implies that I didn't have to initialize the counter inside the for loop. So basically, I could do something like this. Int j is equal to 0 for semicolon j is less than 5. And then I could also say, I'm not going to increment or update in here. I'm going to update in here, j++, something like that. And that is a very, oh, hello without an W. That is a valid code. It works. But the question that I want you to think about, does that look nice? So if you understand the for loop, one of the major things about for loop is that it's very elegant. You can actually put everything inside a single line. You have all of the three parts, the counter, the condition, the update, all of them are in a single line. So when you do something like this, even though technically, syntactically, you can actually do it, it doesn't look nice. Does that make sense? So never use for loop like this. Even though it's valid, I have never seen anybody does that. And if you do it, people will be like, that doesn't look nice. All right. So again, don't do something like this. All right. So that here is this part. So the last thing that we want to conclude with is how to use or where to use loops. All right, and this will apply to all the loops in the future, honestly. So the one thing that you need to know is that loops are used a lot with strings and arrays. All right, so one thing I would like to show you is that if you go to one of the practice websites, for example, something like LeetCode, and you try to open the sorts of or the kind of practices in there, you will not find anything that says like loops alone, right? Nothing about loops. However, you will find that you will need to use a lot of loops when it comes to array and strings. Okay, so what does that mean? For example, and just to keep it short, let's say, for example, I have an integer array here, all right, that goes called nums is equal to, and then I'm going to give it some values here. So 500 negative 520. So if I want to print this, right, one thing that we learned to do is the arrays class. So I could say arrays dot toString and just print nums. And that is going to print this array for me very nicely in that format, right? Okay. So what if I wanted to print this one using a loop? So I could do this. I could say for int I is equal to 0, right? Remember, the array starts from 0, 1, 2, 3. So I could start at 0, pointing here, and then I want to stop at 3, which is the for the length minus 1. So I could say as long as I is less than nums.length I++. And then in this case, I will go and say sysout, and I'm going to print nums of I. So what am I doing here? Basically, what I'm doing is that I'm saying like, hey, every iteration, take a counter, which is the I, get this value and use it as the index to get the value from nums array. So nums of 0 is going to get 5. Nums of 1 is going to get 100. Nums of 2 is going to get -5. Nums of 3 is going to get the 20, sorry, right? So we see how this is working. So if I print it, it's going to print it to me in this way. Okay? So that here is going to print basically the array. Of course, this does not look as nice as the arrays here, but you could make it, right? So for example, I could build something like this. Print, open bracket. And then here, instead of print line, I'm going to say print. So we are getting closer. Then I'm going to add plus. Very good. But I don't like this one. So what do? Well, this takes us to the next node, which we have in the slides, which is the fact that you can have complex code inside the structure of your for loop. So here I could make a condition that says, hey, if the number I is not equal to nums.length, right? If it's not that very last one, I would like you to print this with a comma space. Otherwise, I would like you to print it. This means, otherwise it means what? Otherwise, it means this must be the last element. So in this case, I'm going to print it with a closing bracket. So let's look at that. Boom. It looks exactly the same. You see that? All right. So that's very nice. So we were able to write a code that actually does the same function as the toString. All right. So here's the thing. If I actually open the toString method for you, and here's the interesting thing, you will notice that even Java is written the way we just wrote it. Open bracket, for loop, print it. If it's the last one, print a square closing bracket. Otherwise, print comma space. You see that? It's exactly the same thing. So using for loops with arrays is very, very powerful. Okay? The last note, I promise, before we close this video, is that similar to if statement, if the body of the for loop is just a single line, you can write the loop without curly brackets. So what does that mean? It means that I could simply go and say something like this: for int I is equal to 0, I is less than 5, I plus plus. And instead of writing this, see, Java did, Eclipse made an immediate indentation in here, which tells me that, hey, if you want to write this code, here is the code, and this is going to be hello again. So look at that. It repeated 5 times, even though I didn't have curly brackets. But notice when I hit an enter again, where this line is going to be aligned, not with the system.out, is going to be aligned with the for loop. This is not repeated. There you go. You see it? So again, similar to if statement, if you have a single line in your body of the for loop, you could do without the curly brackets, but be careful that whatever comes after is not going to be repeated. Now, again, as I say, also in the if statement, similarly, I would recommend always to have the curly brackets. The curly brackets makes it easier for you to read. You don't have to do that extra brain exercise to try to figure out which statement is going to be repeated, which statement is going to be running conditionally, and so on. Instead, you have a clear start and end. You have a clear boundaries of your scope for the for loop, so you don't have to worry about it. So always, always, always use your curly brackets instead of trying to do these mind tricks. All right, that's it.